So, the tambourine pair. The first place to start is with white of the jumper. You fill this in just using a satin stitch. You don't need to be too neat here or worry about what direction your satin stitch is going in. When you start filling in the black lines with French knots, you'll find you cover over some of the satin stitch, particularly around the edges. So really here you can just fill it in any way you'd like. It can be a relatively quick process to fill in his jumper like this. So once that is all filled in, that's when we move on to doing the French knots. Now there's a separate video which shows you the process of doing French knots and shows you a bit more detail, but they do take a bit of time to get used to, and therefore if you've never done French knots before, I'd recommend just practicing on a piece of scrap fabric first. You see here, typically French knots are you wrap around the needle once or twice. Here you see I'm wrapping around maybe 3 or 4 times. This is because I'm trying to create quite a lot of volume. It does make the French knots a little bit harder to pull through or to keep neat, but when you're doing so many French knots side by side, I wouldn't worry too much about how neat they are ending up looking. By the time you've filled in quite a large area, you really can't differentiate one French knot from the next. Here you see specifically how I've wrapped that around 4 times, and then I pull it back through, keeping the thread taut. You'll go around the jumper this way, going over all the lines in black. And now you can see what I mean about how you really can't see any of the edges of the areas you filled in with the satin stitch. So overall, the satin stitch automatically looks quite neat by the fact you've edged it with the French knots. And that's the jumper done. So then we move on to the trousers, and you'll start here with the gold thread. We'll start by doing a straight stitch, fill in the zigzag stripes on the trousers. If you haven't worked with gold thread before, it can be a bit tricky to work with. Sometimes it gets caught, gets a little tangled. You get better at working with it over time, but don't worry if you find that yours is getting a little tangled. Just trim it down, cut it off, and I've provided you with plenty of gold, so if you have quite a bit of wastage, don't worry. You'll have enough to be able to create the figure. On these zigzags, again, it's just about really filling in the areas with the thread. Because you're sewing onto the yellow anyway, from a distance you don't really see any gaps in the gold. And as you'll go around and edge each of these zigzag stripes in blue, that ends up creating the overall neat look. So if you feel like while you're doing this, it doesn't look that neat, have faith. And when you start going around in the blue, it really will bring it all together. Here I'm just using a straight stitch. You could fill this in with a satin stitch going from top to bottom on the wider ones, but it doesn't make much difference to the overall look at the end of it. Again, you'll see that there are separate videos on how to do your straight stitch, which you can find in the how-to guides video section. So once you've finished doing the zigzags, that's then we'll start going on to the stars. So here, you're basically just going to follow the lines of the stars in order to create the shapes. So here, you're just going to use straight stitches along the lines of the stars, all going into the centre. So once all the stars are done, we move on to the moon. And the moon is created by using a chain stitch around the edge. Now again, there's a separate video on this chain stitch. Here, I'm using the link method. You'll see that there are two video guides, link and loop. I think link is easier to use here. We just go around the edge of the moon in this chain stitch. At the end, on each corner, I'd stop your chain stitch and start again. You can see that I do this here. Once you finish the chain stitch there, then the moon is done. And we'll move on to getting the dark blue out in order to do the outlines. So we're just going to use the dark blue thread and again do a straight stitch going along the edge of the zigzags. Then once you've got to the end of doing the outlines on the zigzags, you'll start going down the edge of the trousers in a chain stitch. You can see I just carry straight on from here because I'm still using the same blue thread. So we're going to do the outline around the trousers and up the centre of both trouser legs, just using a simple chain stitch. Again, I use the link method here. You could use the loop method. Worth trying both and seeing which one you prefer. Then you'll work around the full edge of the trousers up to the belt at the centre, doing chain stitch the whole way round, and then your trousers are finished. So the belt also uses chain stitch, and it's just back to the gold thread, so again you'll get lots of experience working with the gold. And you're just going to go the whole way around the belt and fill it in using a chain stitch. I think chain stitch ends up being most people's favourite stitch to do, so you'll probably find this bit quite satisfying. The close-up here just shows how you do the chain stitch going around the corners. I think sometimes people worry a bit about how to do it around the edges. So this here you can just see, I just slowly bend the chain stitch around the corner. But there's no special technique to it. So, the tambourines. Again, using your gold thread, you've probably still got some left on your needle. Starting with the tambourine in his left hand, I just do very simple stitches just over the gold lines which are marked onto the fabric. Do those first and then you'll come back over with the black. For the tambourine in his right hand, you're going to try and roughly follow around the circles. You're not going to get a perfect circle. You're probably going to end up doing it with about 5-6 stitches in a round. So more of a pentagon. But don't worry, you'll see in a minute, once we add the black over the top, that you really can't tell that it's not a circle when you've got the black over the top. So it's just about doing maybe 5 stitches around the edge of each, a couple of stitches in the middle. Don't worry too much about how neat they are. So once you've got them all done, as you can see here, then we'll get the black thread and we'll start following that line around the centre using a chain stitch. Now here you can see I'm using a loop method for the chain stitch, which is the other way you could do chain stitch. Again, it doesn't really matter, but because you're going to be stitching straight over the top of the gold, you might find it slightly easier to use the loop method. It really doesn't matter, and the more you do and the more stitching you do, the more chain stitch you do, you'll find you kind of have one you particularly like doing or you feel like it's neatest. But now you can see slightly more what I meant about don't worry too much on the neatness of those circles, because as this line goes round through the middle, it really brings the whole tambourine together. So as we go back over to the other tambourine, you see it's very simple. We just put some black thread in the areas marked on the fabric in black. I go horizontally and then I put a couple of stripes in from top to bottom on either side of that central gold section. And then your tambourine's done. So I would start to do the hair before you start doing the crown. Because your crown will be made up of French knots, it's easier to be able to do this first. I'm literally just using straight stitches. I haven't marked this on the fabric for you because you can go in any way you want, and it makes quite a nice effect when you have the kind of areas of the natural linen coming through under his hair. It makes it look more like he's got strands of hair. So really just build out whatever hairstyle you want, short, long, however you think it should be. So once that hair's all in, then we start moving on to the crown. And so first things first, the fur around the top of the crown, I've mixed together 2 white strands and 1 gold, just so we get a slight shimmer into that. You can often do this, mix together a couple of colours in order to blend to get the exact one you want. So I'm filling this out again with French knots, and you can see here I'm really using maybe 4 or 5 turns around the needle. On that close-up you can see the French knots aren't individually particularly neat, but it's all about creating that furry effect where we have kind of volume coming forward and they're all secured. So I'd really be very generous with putting a lot of French knots in very close together, create the real volume we want. And once that is in, you can go around and put the gold into the crown. So again, I'm just using a straight stitch, fill in all the areas of the crown, apart from leaving just the line around the horseshoe shape, because we'll come back over to those after. So I think it works easiest to work from left to right with your straight stitch, leaving those gaps. You can see on a close-up here exactly how I'm doing that. It's a great thing having the colour printed on the fabric, because it really does mean that you don't see the gaps in the gold. So if you do have any gaps in your sections of gold, you really won't notice that from a distance because of the yellow colour of the fabric, which will make it appear like the whole area is completely opaquely filled with gold. So once your gold is entirely filled in, we'll go around and put the outline of the crown in using the dark blue. For the main outline, we just use a straight stitch going around the edge, and then up in the top corners and on the horseshoes, we'll do French knots again. So by the end of this, you'll know that you're going to be an expert at a French knot. So here you see the French knot going in. Again, I'm wrapping there 4 or 5 times, so it's going to be a really pretty sizable one. And then just gently ease it through the fabric, keeping the thread taut. You see, kind of taking it in a few attempts, pull it through, so I'm being gentle with it, and then pulling it tight. If you really do find that your French knot also just doesn't work or it's a bit messy, then you can cut it off, tie a new knot in the thread, and go again. Once that's all done, we're just going to put some French knots in around these horseshoe shapes. I use a couple less turns of thread around the needle so they'll be a bit smaller. Really, it doesn't matter. However you are comfortable. By this point of the character, you really will have done a fair share of French knots, so I think you'll have pretty good instinct as to how many times you're turning around. Now, almost on to the finishing touches. So first, the shoes, and this is just done in another chain stitch, working up and down the lines. So I'd start either all with the white or all with the black. Here I start with the white. And so I do your chain stitch and fill in all the white stripes first. After then, you're left with gaps, and just go in and put some black thread in, again using your chain stitch. It's very short sections, so if you would rather just use satin stitch here or straight stitch, that's fine. Once you've finished with the chain stitch, then you can just go run an outline around the shoes. So, final touches. Let's give him a face. So this is quite detailed, and you're just going to literally use the white thread in order to do a straight stitch, outlining his nose and his eyebrows. For his eyes, we do 2 French knots. What you may find easier, whilst here I do wrap around a few times, you might find easier to wrap it just once. And you're done.